All right, let's get right into it. We're about to tackle one of the biggest questions in all of human history. But we're going to do it in a way you might not expect. We're pushing theology to the side for a minute to look at the hard, historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll be using a method that pretty much everyone, from believers to the most hardcore skeptics, can agree on.
So here's the question that's going to drive this whole explainer. If we just look at this as a historical detective story, what are the actual clues? What are the facts on the ground that we can all agree on using the same tools historians use for, everything else? This isn't about proving faith, it's about understanding the evidence.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the historical method we're using. Then, we'll dive into 4 core facts that are widely accepted by scholars. And finally, we'll get into the really juicy part, how different historians look at the exact same facts and come to wildly different conclusions. Okay, so to get this right, we need a solid method. We're going with the minimal facts approach. Now, the whole idea here is to only use historical data that is so rock solid that it's accepted by a huge majority of scholars. And I'm talking about scholars from all sides, including those who are really skeptical of the New Testament. Right. So here's the deal. We're not starting with a conclusion and trying to prove it. Nope. We're building a foundation of facts that pretty much everyone agrees on. This becomes our baseline. Any theory out there, whether it's totally natural or something else entirely, has to be able to explain this core set of facts. It basically sets the rules for the entire debate. All right, let's get to our first core fact. And this one is the absolute bedrock of the entire investigation. It's the one thing that gets almost zero argument from historians today. And you have to see who said this. John Dominic Crossan isn't some conservative scholar. He's one of the most prominent and, most skeptical historians out there. So for him to say the crucifixion is a sure thing, that tells you everything. It's just not up for debate in modern history. It happened. And this confidence isn't just based on one thing. We have early Christian creeds that are way older than the Gospels themselves. But, and this is crucial, it's also talked about outside of Christian sources. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions it. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions it. We even have archaeological evidence, like the bones of a crucified man named Johanan, that shows us just how brutal and final this Roman practice was. Now, you might have heard this idea that, maybe Jesus didn't really die. Maybe he just passed out on the cross. It's called the swoon theory, and in modern scholarship, it's a total non-starter. Roman crucifixion was designed to kill you, period. Medically, survival just wasn't possible. Heck, even supercritical scholars back in the 1800s, like David Strauss, were already calling this theory impossible. So, fact 1, Jesus died. We've got that locked down. But this is where the puzzle gets really interesting, because the next 2 facts are all about what happened next, what the disciples claimed they saw, and how it turned their world completely upside down. I mean, just look at this contrast. 1 minute, the disciples are hiding, they're scared, their leader is dead, their movement is over. And then, a little while later, these same guys are out in the streets of the very city where Jesus was killed, boldly proclaiming he's alive, and they're willing to die for it. So, what on earth happened to cause a change like that? And that brings us right to our second core fact. Now, the wording here is super important. Historians, even the skeptical ones, agree on this. The disciples had experiences that absolutely convinced them they were seeing Jesus alive again. Now, the debate is all about what those experiences were: hallucinations, visions, something else. But the fact that they genuinely believed it, that's a key piece of historical data. You know, the earliest account we have of these appearances isn't actually in the Gospels. It's in a little creed that the Apostle Paul quotes. And here's the kicker. Scholars date this creed to within just a handful of years of the crucifixion. I mean, that is incredibly early. We're talking about a direct pipeline to the original eyewitnesses, long before any legends could really develop. So think about it this way. People might die for something they believe is true, even if they're wrong. But people don't generally suffer and die for something they know they just made up. The argument here is that their transformation from scared guys in a room to fearless martyrs is some of the best evidence that whatever happened, they were not lying. They were utterly sincere. Okay, so we've covered Jesus' followers. But this next fact is maybe even more shocking, because it's not about one of Jesus' friends, it's about one of his most determined enemies. Yeah, the story of Saul of Tarsus is just wild. This guy wasn't a sad disciple hoping for a miracle. He was actively hunting down the first Christians. He was their public enemy number 1. And then, boom, he has an experience that he also says was an appearance of the risen Jesus. The result?
A complete 180. He becomes the Apostle Paul, the single most influential missionary of this new faith.
I mean, this change was so sudden, so total, that it screams for an explanation. The critical scholar Reginald Fuller put it perfectly. He said that Paul's conversion is such a solid historical fact that even if we didn't have the stories about it, historians would basically have to invent some kind of massive transformative event just to make sense of his life.
Okay, so let's recap our minimal facts. We have Jesus' death by crucifixion. We have his disciples being absolutely convinced he appeared to them. We have their radical transformation, and we have the shocking conversion of a persecutor, Paul. So, what do we do with all that? This is where the real debate begins.
Well, on one side, you have proponents like Gary Habermas. For him, that super early creed in 1 Corinthians is the smoking gun. He calls it the earliest and best authenticated passage we have because it's so close to the events themselves. It's a direct link to the eyewitnesses, and for him, that's pretty much case closed.
But hold on a second. Skeptical scholars like Robert M. Price wave a huge red flag here. He looks at that same creed and points to the part about an appearance to 500 people. And he asks a pretty good question. If that really happened, why in the world is it not mentioned in any of the 4 Gospels written later? It's a blockbuster detail. Price argues this suggests it might be an interpolation, basically a detail that was added into the text later on.
And Price does the same thing with Paul's conversion. That dramatic road to Damascus story with the blinding light, that's from the book of Acts, which was written much later. If you read Paul's own letters, he's actually pretty vague about the whole thing. Price suggests that maybe it wasn't a sudden miracle, but more of a profound shift inside of his already deep religious worldview.
And then another scholar, Bart Ehrman, throws an even bigger wrench in the works: the burial itself. He makes a really stark historical point. For the Romans, crucifixion was the ultimate public humiliation. The standard procedure for an executed enemy of the state was to leave the body on the cross as a warning for the birds and dogs. The whole idea of a proper burial in a tomb, which is kind of necessary for an empty tomb story, might go against everything we know about Roman practice.
So you're left with 2 very different ways of connecting the dots. On one hand, proponents see all this evidence, the death, the appearances, the transformations, and say it all points to one incredible, unique event. On the other hand, critics look at the same facts and see a series of separate things that can be explained naturally: a standard execution, followed by visions brought on by intense grief, and a story that grew and got more dramatic over the years.
And that right there is the heart of it. Do these facts point to an event unlike any other in history? Or are they a collection of psychological and social events that just happened to combine in a way that launched a world religion? History gives us the data, the death, the sincere beliefs, the transformations. It's up to you to weigh that evidence and decide which explanation makes the most sense.